All right. Well, good to see everybody this morning. 90s already. Man. Midwest. Yep. Got a bike ride in yesterday. So glad. I always see a few new faces every Sunday morning, so it's great to see you. When I was living in Prairie Village as a first through fifth grader, I went to Prairie Elementary School. My neighbor directly across the street from me was my best friend named Michael Jackson. And Michael's here. Michael, you got to wave. If you guys want to meet Michael Jackson, there he is, right there. Right there, man. And we've stayed in touch a little bit over the last 50 years, but so glad to see you, Michael. So much fun. Well, we're in a series called Resurrecting Faith. Resurrecting Faith. And if you think about that title, it implies that maybe you had faith at one time, lost it, and maybe you're having a struggle to find faith again. It could be that you've never really found faith or been comfortable with faith. It could be that you've had faith your whole life and never really ever had much question or doubt. As I reread through all of these interesting resurrection appearances of Jesus in Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, one of the things that stood out to me was that the disciples, after Jesus' crucifixion, were thrown into a tailspin of doubts, questions, disbelief. Their faith had been shattered, and they didn't really know how to put their world back together again. And if you read carefully through the resurrection appearances, you'll find that doubt, that question, that disbelief didn't actually go away instantly, even when they had an appearance of Jesus. It didn't even dissipate right away. It was an ongoing wrestling match with them, an ongoing struggle with them. And so we've been kind of diving into that a little bit because of all that I went through in terms of my own doubts, questions, and disbelief in my darkest days. All of these things kind of popped out to me as I reread these accounts in the Gospels. Now, one of the things I've pointed out over the last few weekends in this series is just a couple of pictures that I want to show you. If these are new to you, I'll explain them real quickly, but show the first one. There's two, what I call icons that we've been looking at. One is from the Western Church. All right, this is an old painting. And the Western Church, I'm talking about the Catholic Protestant tradition, they call this resurrection, but you see, Jesus is making a solo flight into heaven. He's doing a solo flight to heaven. And this is how the whole Western Church history of iconography, these were like the movies of the old days. This is before people, had radio and television. Most people couldn't read or write, so pictures, paintings, depicted like theology. This is probably the ascension, not the resurrection, okay? But this is how the Western Church depicts the resurrection, a solo flight into heaven. The Eastern Church looks like this. This is a painting from the Eastern Church. This would be the Eastern Orthodox Church. Now notice, this is another resurrection appearance, but notice that Jesus is grabbing the hand of Adam and Eve, which represents all of humanity. And if you notice the little plant life, the little plants that are in the kind of oval shape around this thing, in the Eastern Church, resurrection is something that happens in community, actually beginning on earth right now. Okay, so we're resurrected in community together even right now. So it's not a solo flight into heaven, but it's actually something that happens together on earth, all right? Like right now. And so this is what we're looking at. Today, we're going to look at another resurrection appearance. By the way, Mark's gospel has 0 resurrection appearances. Luke's gospel has 2. Matthew's gospel has 2. And John's gospel has 4. And we're going to look at the last of the resurrection appearances in John's gospel today. And it's from John chapter 21. And I love it because it starts out with Peter saying, I'm going fishing. Any fishermen or women in the audience today? Let me see. All right, there's a handful. So you got to set the stage a little bit. The disciples are still a bit in disbelief, doubts, questions. They're not sure where their life is going. Their dreams have been broken and shattered. They're not sure about their future. And they're up in Galilee because Jesus has said, hey, go up to Galilee. I'm gonna hang out with you up there a little bit, and so they're up in Galilee, and you can tell they don't know really what to do with themselves. They'd been following Jesus for 3.5 years. They had staked their future. Like Peter was a fisherman, right? But he had left fishing, if you remember, to follow Jesus. So he had not been a commercial fisherman for the last 3 years or so. He'd been following Jesus. He'd given up that career. And now all of a sudden he's like, oh no, what do we do now? Jesus is dead, he's crucified, and then there's these mystical resurrection appearances, and it's like, well, what does this mean? Like, they don't even really understand what all this means yet. And so Peter's kind of up there, probably, by the way, feeling a bit embarrassed, ashamed, full of doubts, questions himself. He had failed miserably in front of all of his fellow disciples, right? And so he's like, well, I'm going to go fishing. I'm going to go fishing. So, actually, if your world's blown apart and you're filled with doubts, questions, and disbelief, sometimes it's not a bad thing to go back and do something that you're comfortable with, right? You kind of just go back to something that you know, that is safe, and maybe even a few safe friends. I know after my life blew up, I'd just go bike ride with some of my friends. Like even just that was a little bit healing, just to go out on a bike ride with some friends. Like my cycling buddies never stopped loving me. I was like, hey, this is cool. I just go biking with my friends. Or I could have gone fishing with my dad. So I started fishing when I was a little kid. Like my dad had a fishing pole. I had a basketball in my hands as soon as I could dribble the thing. And I probably had a fishing pole in my hand as soon as I could fish. So I was taught fishing from my dad. And I have a favorite fishing quote that I just wanted to read you just because Peter's going to go fishing. And I thought, yeah, it's a little off the beaten path, but it's my favorite opening paragraph for, I think, one of the best novels on fishing that's ever been written. It's a guy it's called Norman Maclean wrote a novel called A River Runs Through It. And it came out as a movie in the 90s. Brad Pitt, was in it. So it's actually a good movie too, but it's a great novel. Here's the opening line to the novel, A River Runs Through It. In our family, there was no clear line between religion and fly fishing. We lived at the junction of great trout rivers in western Montana, and our father was a Presbyterian minister and a fly fisherman who tied his own flies and taught others. He told us about Christ's disciples being fishermen, and we were left to assume, as my brother and I did, that all first-class fishermen on the Sea of Galilee were fly fishermen. And that John, the favorite, which we're looking at now, right, was a dry fly fisherman. Isn't that great? How many of you ever been dry fly fishing? All right, Bill, all right. Yeah. Well, my dad taught me how to fish in the lakes and streams around the Midwest and Minnesota and the Great Lakes, all over the place. But I also learned to fly fish up in the high Rocky Mountain lakes, and I love to dry fly fish. And I don't tie my own flies, but if I find a good trout lake with cutthroat trout is what I really like to catch. And I use like a royal coachman or a mosquito or a black ant or a grasshopper. And you just toss that thing out on the top of a lake and bam, those trout surface. And it's a lot of fun. But a lot of fishing happened on the Sea of Galilee. When I was in Jerusalem and then I went up to the Sea of Galilee, actually got into one of the boats, probably about like what Peter went fishing in, and actually went out onto the Sea of Galilee. Now, Peter was not a dry fly fisherman, all right? He was a net fisherman. Any of you been to Alaska and seen the way they do some of the salmon runs up there? The boats put out nets, and they net the salmon runs, right? Well, that's kind of how Peter and his commercial fishermen would have fished on the Sea of Galilee. They would have been net fishermen. Sometimes they would have had two boats. They'd put the net between them. They'd drag the net and then catch the fish around. Well, Peter is with about 7 of the disciples. He said, I'm going fishing. And they go out like probably early in the morning. It's at night, but they like to fish early in the morning, right? So they might have been out there fishing 2, 3, 4, 5 a.m. in the morning during the nighttime. And they didn't catch anything. How many of you have ever been fishing and didn't get a thing? Yeah, like that's no fun at all, right? You don't go fishing to get skunked like that, all right? So they're out fishing all night. They don't catch a thing. So it's becoming dawn. The peak fishing hours are over a little bit. They're going back to the shore, and this guy's on the shore, and what does he say to them? They're about 100 yards out, a football field length out on the Sea of Galilee, and the guy on the shore calls out to him, what do you say to fishermen? Catch anything? And of course, a fisherman hates to say, nah, we didn't catch a thing. We like to tell how many or how big or whatever, but we don't like to say, we didn't catch a thing. And they were like, we didn't catch anything. So, but guess what? They didn't recognize Jesus on the shore. Did you notice that? Like, who's that guy? He's asking us, he's up early in the morning. Hey, did you catch anything? By the way, if you look at these resurrection appearances, they're kind of mystical. Like one of the first ones, Mary, she's at the thing, and Jesus appears to her, and he doesn't even recognize her. She thinks he's the gardener. And then all of a sudden, after some conversation, all of a sudden, the guys walking on the road to Emmaus, they didn't recognize Jesus right away. And then all of a sudden, it was like, oh, not until he broke the bread, remember, did they all of a sudden, oh, this is another one where like Jesus on the shore and, hey, did you catch anything? Nah, we didn't catch a thing. And then he goes, well, throw your nets out on the right side of the boat. Well, these guys are professional fishermen. They don't need advice. And listen, if you're a really good fisherman and you don't catch anything, you certainly don't want some amateur telling you why you didn't catch something and how you can do it better. Like you're going, yeah, you little, and you just don't. It's just not what you really want to hear, right? All right, so, but like they're going, oh, okay. I'm sure they begrudgingly, yeah, sure, we'll do it, They throw their nets out, and what do they catch? Huge catch, 153 fish. Evidently, they counted those. Do you ever count your fish? Count those suckers, right? And, man, we caught 153 today. Yeah, that's a lot of catching, all right? So, well, then John, the beloved disciple, right? He never says like, hey, I'm John and I'm writing this book here, but he just always says, hey, the one that was Jesus, like the beloved disciple. Like John always wanted you to know he was the favorite, all right? He always just puts that in there a little bit. By the way, when Mary Magdalene saw the empty tomb, she ran to the disciples. Remember, then Peter and John run to the tomb. And what does John say in his gospel? He's a bit competitive. What does he say? John ran on, the beloved, by the way, the beloved disciple beat Peter to the tomb. Like he is faster than, he wanted everybody to know, I'm faster than Peter. I beat him to the tomb. Just a little side note for all of you. So now John hears Jesus say this, and he's like, I think that might be the Lord. And then Peter's like, oh. And then what does Peter do? Like he pulls up and he jumps out of the water and runs out, right? So he was the impulsive one, Peter was. He was the one that would always vocalize his loyalty faster than anybody. He was always the one ready to live, ready to die, ready to do anything. He'd do anything for Jesus. He was the most vocal. He was the most impulsive. He was the most outspoken. And so even down, if you remember, to the last night before Jesus was crucified at the Lord's Supper, like Jesus saying, hey, one of you is going to, betray me. Somebody's going to deny me. And like Peter's like, I'd never do that. No way, no how. And then Peter was, even when Jesus was arrested, he was the one that pulled his sword and cut off Malchus's ear, who was the high priest's servant. He was ready to even fight for Jesus, right? But then, into the hours after Jesus is arrested, after Jesus is beaten, after Jesus is lashed, cruelly tortured, like this is his leader who all of a sudden is being beat, tortured, and then headed to crucifixion. So a little bit of trauma dynamic going on here, right? A little bit of trauma, like you go through, like men and women in battle see their fellow soldiers go down. We talk about trauma, PTSD. We're very familiar with those things, but there's a lot of different kinds of trauma that can go on. When you see your loved one go through like torture publicly and then be raised and crucified, I mean, this is pretty traumatic stuff. And in the middle of the night, Peter is now on his own, kind of around a campfire, circling around, watching what's happening to Jesus. Somebody recognizes him and say, hey, you were one of his closest guys. And what does Peter do? Like, no, that wasn't me. Like, he's in fear now. Like, he's completely flipped his role. He's gone from the most bold, willing to die, willing to fight. Now he's in fear, and the fear takes over. And 3 different times somebody, hey, you were one of his closest disciples. Well, if you're one of his closest disciples and they're doing that to Jesus, who are they going to do next? They're coming after you next, right? They're going to take the leader out, and then they're going to take his closest followers out. Peter was one of those. Peter's in fear. Like, no, I never even knew the guy. Not me. That was somebody else. I never knew him. 3 times. And then the cock crows. Jesus and then what do you think Peter felt in this moment? And all the days after that moment, up even to this moment, what did he feel? Well, he's in trauma. He's seen his best friend tortured to death. His dreams around following Jesus are smashed and broken. He doesn't know what to do. The best he knows is go back and fish. He's ashamed. This is now known. All the disciples who knew him to be the boldest, he was the leader. Peter means the rock, right? Peter means the rock. And he's ashamed. He's full of, have you ever had an inner critic inside your head that just beats you up for something you've done, or maybe for something somebody else did to you? Maybe you've been abused. Maybe you've gone through some kind of other type of trauma, maybe even religious trauma. And man, we can have a negative inner critic that can just self-hate us, beat us up, like almost curse yourself out. Like there's this harsh inner critic that can come. I guarantee you Peter's dealing with that kind of internal voice that's just full of shame, full of humiliation, full of doubt, all that kind of stuff. So they catch a bunch of fish. They get onto the shore. Jesus has got a little fire going. He feeds them some fish and bread. What does that remind the disciples of? Fish and bread. the miracle of the 5,000. If you remember the miracle of 5,000, Jesus was there and he found the fish and the bread and he took it, he blessed it, he broke it, and he gave it. And that's what happened at the miracle of 5,000. And then their participation in that miracle was what made it happen. They had to participate with Jesus. They handed it out. And it's illustrating the fact that as God works in the world, we have to participate. Faith isn't something that is just kind of ethereal out in left field. Faith is a word about trust. So if your trust in God is shattered, then your faith in God can be shattered. If your trust in a person is shattered, then your faith in people can be shattered. If your trust in yourself is shattered, then your faith in yourself can be shattered. So there's like three realms of faith. There's faith in God, faith in others, and faith in ourselves. That's a trust word. And actually, when I went through my deal, I felt all of that was shattered. My faith in myself was shattered. My faith in other people was shattered. And my faith in God even was shattered, right? So all of that can, like, be shattered. But it's interesting, when Jesus fed the fish and the bread, it immediately reminds them of the 5,000, and then it would also immediately remind them of the Lord's Supper, because remember at the Lord's Supper, when he took the bread and the wine, Jesus took it, blessed it, broke it, and gave it, the same words. So like, as we share the Lord's table, it's this beautiful, radical inclusion of all people through forgiveness, through deliverance, through grace, and we come together. It's a beautiful picture. So Peter is on the bank, and there's this beautiful scene in his trauma, in his shame, in his guilt, in his failure, his deepest failure, deepest shame, trauma surrounding it. What does Jesus do? Look at verse 15, John 21, verse 15. After breakfast, Jesus asked Simon Peter, "Simon, son of John, do you love me more than these?" Peter replied, "You know I love you. Then feed my lambs." Jesus told him again, "Simon, son of John, do you love me?" "Yes, Lord," Peter said, "you know I love you." "Then take care of my sheep," Jesus said. The third time he asked, "Simon, son of John, do you love me?" Peter was hurt by this time. Jesus asked the question the third time, and he's like, "Lord, you know everything. You know I love you." So you hear the, like, Jesus, you know everything, man. I've blown it. I've screwed up. I know it. But I love you. I love you. And then Jesus, a third time, then what? Feed my sheep, lambs. John likes to vary the language, so he did that here. But it's a beautiful, beautiful scene as God comes to us, maybe in our deepest shame or our deepest failure or our deepest trauma. You know, some psychologists talk about resiliency as something that when we encounter adversity, we bounce back. If we're resilient, we bounce back quickly from adversity. But you know, trauma can be almost impossible to bounce back from. Trauma can take you out at your deepest level. It can be self-inflicted. A lot of mine was self-inflicted, but it can also be inflicted by others. And people can judge, and people can hate, and people can abuse, and people can hurt. And so, and then we can go through extraordinary physical trauma or emotional trauma. There's a lot of forms of trauma. And trauma is very, very difficult to bounce back from. And trauma-informed therapy is a very, very important part of understanding sort of the healing process. What's interesting is that there's a thing called post-traumatic growth. Post-traumatic growth. And people who go through some of the deepest forms of shame and trauma and abuse, and even soldiers, all that whole realm, when they go through trauma, it's very challenging. It can wipe you out at your very core, your foundational beliefs, your foundational belief in yourself, other people, and even God. It can just literally level you. And then how do you rebuild? How do you find a new foothold? One of my points here is that we don't do it alone. Recovery from trauma, recovery from shame, recovery from deepest failure is not a solo flight into heaven. It's a community process right here on earth. And here's the crazy thing about it, is in order to really heal from trauma, guess what? We have to share our deepest failures or our deepest shame or with people that are safe, like a therapist, like a sponsor, like a counselor, or like some really close friends. And you have to talk about it. You have to share it with safe people. And guess what those safe people do? Even if you don't believe in God, if they believe in God, they model God's love and forgiveness for you. Even if you've lost faith in other people, this group of people can model love and forgiveness for you, and hope and recovery for you. So it's interesting. It's why when alcoholics work with alcoholics, they understand the shame and the pain, and there's something powerful about alcoholics helping alcoholics heal and recover. Abuse victims can help abuse victims as they share their shame, as they share their pain, as they share their abuse in a safe place with other people who have gone through the same thing. Those places of deep, deep failure and pain and suffering can actually become the places where we connect with people, loving, safe people in new and fresh ways. And faith begins to percolate up a little bit when we open up and we have people love us anyway. I see God coming to Peter, Jesus coming to Peter, right? And at his deepest failure, 3 denials, that was the most of his, but he had gone through trauma and all other kinds of stuff, right? But there's this picture of Jesus coming and, number one, Peter, you're loved more than you could ever realize. And this is what I just want you to let this wash over you today. If there's a God, I think it's a God of extraordinary love, and he loves you more than you could ever imagine. You're loved. He knows everything about you. He knows but he loves you over the top, reckless love of God, like we just sang today. He loves you. Number 2, if you failed, like I did, guess what? You're forgiven. It's like, you denied 3 times. Jesus like, do you love me? Do you love me? Do you love me? It's like 3 times. Jesus kind of digs into that pain, right? But then what is he saying? I love you. I forgive you. He's also saying, I affirm you. Some of the trauma we go through is sometimes inflicted by other people. And we need to hear that voice of affirmation at our deepest self. It's our truest self. You are loved. You are affirmed. If you need it, you are forgiven. And then, the beautiful thing about it, you're recommissioned. Like, there's hope for you if you share your deepest pain, deepest sorrow, deepest failure with other people who have experienced that same deep shame, deep failure, deep pain. There's a beautiful connection. Here's some of the signs of post-traumatic growth. If you think about Peter after this point, or us, there's a deeper appreciation of life once you've gone through hell and back. There's a stronger relationship with loved ones and the people that you connect with, particularly the survivors or those who have gone through it similar to you, if you open up with them. There's a recognition of new opportunities. Out of this darkness can emerge new opportunities. There's an inner strength that comes when you've overcome something pretty extraordinary. And your spirituality changes and evolves. It doesn't stay the same. Sometimes your concepts of God shift and change. Sometimes your concepts of community shift and change. But it usually moves if you're growing in a healthy, new way. We don't experience a rebirth alone. It's not a solo flight. Jesus affirms Peter, loves Peter, forgives Peter, and then recommissions him. And I believe this is what God would do to all of us in any situation, no matter how dark or how painful we've journeyed. I want to close with a quote from Richard Rohr, one of my favorite authors. He says, "If we do not transform pain, we will most assuredly transmit it." So if we don't transform pain, then we'll transmit it. Usually to those closest to us, our family, our neighbors, our coworkers, and invariably the most vulnerable, like children. If we don't transform it, which can be a very long, arduous process where we're broken open and we have to share our deepest secrets or shame or failure or the abuse that we've gone through, and we share that with other people who are safe, who have gone through it. And in that sharing and in that vulnerability, there's a connection of the human spirit that begins to bring a rebirth to faith, a faith in God, a faith in others, and a faith in ourselves. It's a process. It can be a painful process. It can be a time-consuming process. But if it works if we do the work, as some of us like to say. It works if we do the work. Let's pray. God, come and do a work in our hearts today. And speak to us in the deep places of our life. Speak your love, speak your forgiveness, speak your affirmation, and speak that commissioning where our lives, if we allow ourselves to be broken open, can lead to new life, not only in ourselves, but in others as well. So we pray for that beautiful work of resurrection in community together in our most vulnerable, deep places of hurt and pain and suffering. We pray it in Jesus' name. Amen. Jordan's going to